Thank you very much. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
What I ended up doing after our work together, which was excellent, it's really nice to meet somebody in person, and you've been on Zoom. What it occurred to me that actually is better to do, although I was end up with telling you more and quoting you from the earlier rule, is actually a little bit more background, because this understanding of penitence and penance is something that, while it dates right back to the Old Testament, to the prophets, there's always been the call of God to do things, the unfaithfulness, the recalling to turn back. But really, maybe it would be helpful here. The documents are there and available, but just to have a little bit of routine in where this actually comes from. And how, in a way, we've come to the state where penance isn't understood to be as rich as it was in the Old Testament. So that's what I'm going to spend most of the session on. And I will try just at the, we'll see how it goes. Feel free to ask questions. It's not pictures that you're getting, it is basically the talk with a little bit of added on. Okay? So, I start off with Amos. I had another vision from the Lord. In it, I saw him standing beside a wall that had been built with the use of a plumb line. And there was a plumb line in his hand. He asked me, Amos, what do you see? A plumb line, I answered. Then he said, I'm using it to show that my people are like a wall that is out upon. And the other image I use today to convey the same thing is, if you're doing a document, do you want it fully justified? So what's Amos getting at? What are we hearing there? We have not, we have desire to be in direct relationship with God, to be faithful to God, to be his faithful people, but we go there. So that's really, to me, what is penance about? Penance is about trying to get the straight line, trying to make sure the wall is straight, trying to make sure that we are fully justified. And there is a call to discipleship that demands the gift of oneself, of sharing your life. So what we find is, what we had in the Old Testament, we then get demanded by Christ in the disciples. So where I think today, and I think sometimes in thinking about the Old Testament, the emphasis became on the harsh ascetical practices. But that isn't what Jesus' focus was. Because in the Old Testament, conversion of heart really meant the change of heart comes from the inside. And I think that's very much where we get offenses. It is the inner conversion that is demonstrated in how you treat others and how you live your life. But the important thing is the conversion of heart. So the prodigal son, we have the father who desires reconciliation, and then that would be conversion of heart, mind, and life. But the unreconciled elder brother is jealous of heart and hard of heart. So what we've got is a very broad understanding of penance. We sometimes use the word metanoia in the Old Testament. So it was inner, it was action, it was calling for a close relationship with God, and it affected your behavior. It was affecting things you did. But Jesus brings us back to focus on the change of heart. So yes, from baptism, you're seeking that you will have repented for sins, and initially in the early church, it was thought that you actually couldn't, after baptism, you couldn't have a way of coming into the. And that was true for quite a long period in the church. And that led to a different group of penitents. We're not going to spend a lot of time on that, but penitents were always part of the church. And like the front line, didn't always get in the right direction. So the apostles then were asking us to repent, reform, to turn to God, and your sins will be wiped away. This is necessary before baptism, which brings about the forgiveness of sin. Faith, believe the good news of Jesus is a fundamental requirement for Christians. Reconciliation with the Father can only be achieved through Jesus, the way to eternal life. Repentance is effected through Christ. So we have the apostles continuing what they have learned from the Lord, what baptism meant, what resurrection meant, are the only way to the Father is the Son, and that repentance requires us, is effected through Christ and our relationship with Christ. So the church, especially once it became the Latin church, especially once we get to the continuing use of Latin being the preferred language as if it was the one that was originally there. I don't agree, but that's how it is. And there is a need, we talked about it before. There's a need for law, there's a need for statutes, there's a need for constitutions. And so we have these continuing codifications, the canon law of the church. But as time went on, it became more and more important that people showed that they were penitent by their actions. For somebody who had fallen out of grace with the community would be completely exiled from the community, would have to be forgiven by the bishop and brought into the community again. And it came to be that it was more about the action, much more about that than the change of heart. So what was happening was that it was getting more remote from just looking to the will of God, the desire to please God, and that it was demonstrated because you had external acts. And I think that that's even more so in private confession, because you go to confession and say your sins and do what you do. So basically, this idea of conversion of heart and that spirit, and the conversion of heart bringing us closer to God, leading us to praise God, leading us to look at who we are. Francis said, what I am before God, that I am and nothing more. So there is at the same time as the church is becoming more restricted in its view of confession, there will always continue to be this desire to get back to what does it really the whole movement. And this is where the use of the word metanoia has become fairly, I would say the one I still use. Oxford dictionaries define this as a change in one's way of life, resulting from penitence or spiritual conversion. What he demanded of people was metanoia, repentance, a complete change of heart. Dies Facio Penitentium is a wonderful song. And it means those who, concerning those who did penance. And in this book, we have a deep analysis of all the rules that affected the Franciscan penitents and the history of penance. Now, Francis doesn't just drop down and bring about this life, this new way of looking at things at all, in no way. So in the centuries, 2 centuries preceding Francis, particularly a century coming up to him, there was a great change among ordinary Christians. There was a time when there was a great desire for people who were not clerics, who were not scholars,
to take themselves back to the gospel, to develop their prayer life, to look and say, what is it that Christ wanted? What did he want of his early followers? What did he want of the people around him? And so there was already a movement which we could see as what Francis's penitential movement is part of. So it doesn't just jump down, and we're going to look at one of those a little later on. So for Christians in the early 13th century, doing penance did not simply mean repenting of one's sins and receiving the sacrament of penance, because that's sort of a personal, I'm okay, I confess my sins, all of this, and I'll do what I've been told, and then that's fine. But no, penance became a state of life. So as we are today in the seculars or in the tertiaries, you are devoting your life, you are penitent all your life. So it became recognized as a state. And one of the things that is different about that time and us today, when you talked about religious, you weren't talking about priests, monasteries, cloisters, communities, regular communities. You weren't talking about that. Does anyone remember why it was that Francis, the civil magistrates could say, we're not going to hear you, Francis has to go to the bishop? Why was it that the civil magistrates didn't have to face Pietro Bernardone?
Because he was a religious, because he was a penitent.
Yes. Yes. And at that time, well, we know he was just reviewing his life. It's early in his conversion. But even the fact that he's rebuilding churches, the fact that he's working with lepers, that really puts him into this sort of state of living penance. And so if you're living penance, you come under church law. So we don't have quite the same division of church, religious and secular as we have today. So they took quite literally the gospel admonition, repent, for the kingdom of God is at hand. Conversion, this response of repentance, was established, realized, and deepened through a life of penance. So what comes first for a penitent is what is the beginning of Mark's gospel. Repent and believe the good news. To genuinely repent, you can only do that with the grace of God. So repentance and prayer are at the heart of anyone who is seeking to be a penitent. And if you are genuinely trying to do that, your life changes. And you try to stay faithful to that life of penitence. By the 11th century, so remember there always have been penitents, but by the 11th century, there is a distinct class of people in the church recognized as religious, known as penitents. At the time of Francis, a religious was defined as someone who made profession to a rule and wore a particular habit. That's why the orders will begin, the groups will begin to want to have a rule. Francis lived during Lateran Council IV, which is a very important council in the church. And one of the demands of Lateran Council IV is that you had to have a rule of life. So bear in mind, Lateran Council is 1215. Francis and his brothers have been joining together in 1208, 1209. Thanks probably to Guido, certainly with the help of the cardinal, that Francis with his little troop goes off in about 2012 with 10 followers, goes to the papal curia, and basically says, what do you want? We want to have the right to live the gospel. And we all know the reaction. That's too difficult. Who can live the gospel? And one of the sources says, go and live among the pigs. And Francis quite literally goes out, lives among the pigs and comes back. But there was a cardinal who was, I mean, I think a lot of the things that happen in Francis' life, there is somebody behind. I'm digressing, but how could Claire have been tonsured, haircut by Francis without the foreknowledge? How come she's given, this power on Pound Sandy, etc.? So basically, there are a lot of, whether Francis is conscious of it, deliberately conscious of it, there are people who are going to enable him to follow the path he wants to follow, but within the church. So basically, 1215 is important in that demands that there is a rule. Of Francis, we don't have the early rule, the very, very, very early rule, which is what was approved. Scholars have put together a very brief wording of what it might be, but it was enough to say that by 1215, they had a rule. And the penitents who follow Francis are going to seek a rule. Otherwise, they will not fit in with this. Someone who made profession to a rule and wore a particular habit. So we have this large group of penitents. Some of them, and quite a lot of them, were distrusted and were accused of heresy. Many penitents, as well as the good works they do, there was a drive in penitence for evangelization. There was a desire to go and preach the word. Francis is told very clearly when he grows with his group of 12, yes, you can preach penance, that is, encourage, exhort, admonish people, but no doctrine. And so some of the early penitential groups are accused of heresy. And there is a battle, but that battle has preceded Francis. So he benefits from the group that we'll look at in a minute. So that's why there has to be a rule after 1215. The same thing will apply, the fact that third order regular had the same rule as we up until the 16th century is because that gave them a rule of life that wasn't Benedictine, Augustinian. It was, I get the impression that you would go to the bishop and say, I want to start over. Oh, here's my door. Benedictine, Augustinian. So this, and actually others who are not Franciscan use the Franciscan rule. It was a way of staying within the rules of the church, approve, have a rule, and basically that way of life. So Francis has benefited, not Francis, the penitents, benefited from the experience of the groups before. So penitents were very varied, as we are today, no difference at all. But they wore a habit, the reason we've seen. They engaged in a range of charitable activities, leprosaria, pilgrim hospices. As you know, pilgrimage was a way of doing penance. And you might say, as a rich lord, oh, Sue, would you mind going and doing penance for me? Because I can't go on pilgrimage. And Sue would mean that you've done your work. So basically, going on pilgrimage, but of course, if you're a pilgrim, you need somewhere to stay. And so some of the work was looking after pilgrims in the various hospices. It varied. It's too broad. It's like, how do we say what religious do today? But it's as varied as that. But of course, the leprosaria working, they were very important, and there were a few people who worked with them, but many penitents did. Some would attach themselves to a monastery. And I mean, a monastery is like a mini village. So in a monastery, you have to have everything you need for a community to live. And so you would be living in the monastery, sometimes you'd be called an oblate. And you could be doing any sort of work, but you wouldn't be joining that monastic order as such. For all, prayer life was central. And if you were married, not initially, but this changes. Initially, you were to be incontinent. No, I mean, conscious. The mind boggles, especially those days. Anyway, but that has changed. That changes, even again before we get our rule, that is changed in the rule that is established before us. Fasting and abstinence. So those were characteristics of the way of life of the penitents. Some lived as pilgrims, others as hermits, recluses. Some dedicated themselves as oblates to service of the church. Others took part in works of charity. But what they had in common was that they all had undergone a religious conversion. And we still have the word sometimes conversi. So another word for penitent is conversi. The church extended to them the privileges of the clergy. So you can see this is all tying in now with the 1215 Act, and they're given these privileges. And this case of Francis was to be heard by the bishop, not the magistrates. The privilege of the clergy is why they were classified then as religious. So I think that's clear enough. 1215, the classification demands the order have a rule and a habit. And our understanding of religious today is narrower, is also more specific. So we will think of religious in a much narrower sense. Okay. Innocent III, we talked about earlier. It was Pope Innocent III who recognized the group of penitents called the Humiliati, that really, in a sense, are the ones that we owe a lot to. He gave them, remember this before 1215, but the Humiliati, when they started, did the wide range of work that we've talked about, but they actually, as we'll see in a minute, they have three classes. They have clergy, they have people living in their homes, and they have people in community. So there's quite a parallel between us and the Humiliati. And they were initially accused of heresy. I think I've got this in wrong order. They're accused of heresy, but it is Innocent III become accused of heresy because of preaching. They were told they couldn't preach, they couldn't not preach. And it took Innocent 2 years, from 1199, when they came back and said, we really want to be recognised by you, to 1201, when they get the Propositum Vitae. Propositum Vitae. What do I propose to do in my life? What is proposed? Vitae, form of life. Rules were called forms of life. So our rule is a Propositum Vitae. This is setting out how it is that we will hope to follow. And there's another group called the Poor Catholics who also got recognition by Innocent III. And the Memoriale Propositi, in effect, becomes our initial document. But our so just to say a bit more about the Humiliati, they were a lay community in Normandy. They had the three integrated orders. They sought to follow according to the letter of the gospel and expound the truths of faith. And that's why they were initially condemned as heretics in 1179. But gradually they are accepted. But I think just the fact that there are three orders, that they have this, that they have as wide, really, a breadth of things as we do, makes them, in a sense, I think our true, what you call it, ancestors, really, the ones that set the scene for what we were going to do. So that's Humiliati. So Francis' early companions, it's in the Legend of Three Companions and Sisi compilation. They'll often say, who are you? This is Francis and his brothers. And they'll say, well, we are penitents from Assisi. And of course, they are involved in itinerant preaching, and they exhort listeners to do penance, which meant changing their behavior towards God and neighbor. Recognize they were sinners, not to attribute to themselves the good things God has given, and directs not to direct action to exaltation of self. A penitent would come to know that God loves the world and all creatures. They underwent a change of heart. They could turn towards others, especially those in greatest need, who were living images of the poor, humble Christ. You all recognize that. That's what Francis and his early penitents are seeking to do. So it becomes a much wider movement. As I said, it fitted into penitential movements at the time, whether they lived in homes or perhaps they might live in hermitages. And what they did was to meet regularly, to deepen their spiritual lives and to embark on local projects, whatever it was that they were committed to doing, often seeking the guidance of a friar. Now that is new, that is Franciscan penitence, because the Memoriale Propositi that was given to Humiliati just required that they had someone who would come, who would talk to them, who they could confess to, who could watch out for heresy. But when we get the difference, one of the differences with our Memoriale Propositi is that it specifies that it should be a friar. It should be a member of the First Order who helps. First Order don't want this for very long, but it is there, and that continues. People want to learn that there is this revival, they want to learn about scripture, and education is more available for some. Again, the new teaching doctrine was forbidden, but they could preach penance. And I think we always, what does Francis preach? Peace. And I think that greeting of peace is something also that marks out the Franciscan penitents. Some penitents chose to live in community. Some were admitted to recluses and hermitages. One example is there. There were two types of groups, therefore, those that lived in community, whether it was doing work publicly or whether it was an eremitical community, and those who lived in their homes. And this is the Memoriale Propositi. Now, we don't have this 1221 Memoriale Propositi, but we know that it exists. The Memoriale Propositi, if you think that these small groups would have set up in different places, it's still true today in the Catholic Church that if you want to set up to do a good work, you need the permission of the bishop. Because of the width and breadth and the universal nature of the Franciscan order, that doesn't apply. But generally speaking, if we're setting up a secular fraternal group, we won't be stopped by the bishop, but we have to have permission of the bishop. But you can imagine that at this time, you're talking about fairly local groups of penitents. And for practicality, they would look at their particular needs. And so what you have between 1221 and 1289, which is our first proper rule, you have extant 4 Memoriale Propositi from different parts. The one we tend to use is the Capistrano one, doesn't matter. But basically, what would be different would be, say, for example, I'm in an area where the cheapest fabric is, whatever it is available. To keep it plain, I will use that color. My money, my soldi will be different, euros, pounds. So what you have is a very local Memoriale Propositi. So you will go from, say, Lombardy, you will get permission, you'll get ordered, but it will be for your particular area. So the initial Memoriale Propositi we have are slightly variant. The variation will be according to this, what you wear, what events you attend. But basically, the 4 that we have, we know depended on 1221. And the difference between the 1221 and the Humiliati is much more detailed. And I'll just go through the things it covers, and I'll just give one example. modesty in dress and appropriate entertainment, abstinence and fasts, life of prayer, including confession and communion, reconciliation with others, the prohibition against bearing arms and taking oaths. Now that sadly changes. When we get supramontum, the first rule for the order of penitents in 1289, it is changed. You don't bear arms unless what?
The bishop says.
The crusade. You're being asked to do it by the Pope. Or so, regrettably, that characteristic, which is so, to me, very important. Monthly meeting, care of the sick and the dead, role of the minister, admission and perseverance in the fraternity, avoidance of heresy and dissension, election of offers, obligation of norms. Now, just one example of the manner of dress, the detail, that this is us. This is the memorial posted for us. Let the men of this fraternity wear garments of ordinary colourless cloth, the price of which shall not exceed the 6 soldi of Ravenna. You see the local. That couldn't be applied universally, per yard of cloth. Unless they will be dispensed from this time to time, if you're being given an honour, if you're doing something in secular life that requires you wear something else. But basically, your main dress is plain costume. The width and length of the cloth should be included in the same price. So quite definite. Let them have cloaks and furred outer garments without any opening of the neck. Horrifying to think of a man having an opening of his neck. But anyway, it was to be in one piece, not buckled as the seculars wear, and with closed sleeves. The sisters wear cloaks and tunics of ordinary cloth of the same price, or at least with the cloak, let them have black or white skirts or dresses, or a roomy linen robe without plaits, whose cost is not more than 12 denarii of Ravenna soldi per yard. So really, if you think of how important cloth is, who you are, what your class is, this is really quite specific, and you will look different from other people. According to the state of each woman and the local custom, they may be dispensed from the price and manner of algebra. And so if your husband is a great lord and you're going to a fancy do, or even going to church, you can dress a little bit more. Let them not wear silk or coloured ribbons or cords, and let the brothers as well as the sisters have furs of lambskin only. It is unlawful to have other than leather purses and the thongs sewn without silk. Other ornaments let them put away at the judgment of the visitor. So that's just to give you an example of the detail. Now, what you had in the one before is simply your clothes ought to be neither too elegant nor too shabby, but of a kind that have no irreligious note about them, for neither affected dirtiness nor shabbiness nor exquisite measures of neatness and elegance are suitable for Christian. So sort of the difference and the particularity. And that continues. So where you have a short instruction about abstinence for the humiliati, which is unless prevented by sickness, weakness or labour, each one should fast on Wednesdays and Fridays, excepting the days of Pentecost and from Christmas to Epiphany and other solemn days. For us, let all abstain from meat except on Sundays, Tuesdays and Thursdays, unless because they are weak, have been bled, in which case they're excused for 3 days, or on a journey. Because of a special solemnity occurring, exception is for this as well, so Nativity, Epiphany, 3 days at Easter, the Apostles Peter and Paul, the Nativity of John the Baptist, the glorious Assumption of the Virgin Mary, and the Feast of All Saints and St. Martin. So again, there's a specificity about our one that isn't there for the others. And the other days of non-fasting, it is lawful to eat cheese and eggs, but when the religious in their convents, it shall be lawful them to eat what is set before them. And it goes on in that way. So Our Memoriale Propositi is more detailed. And again, it will vary. There will be a standard, all of that would apply, but it would be according to what is required in your area itself. So the reason why we need to know about this is because without it, the order would not have been able to exist. That I think we need to realise that Francis is not unique, that Francis is not new, that this penitential tradition, particularly in the 2 centuries leading up to the life of Francis, is well established. That the understanding of penance and penitence and the depth and breadth has been lost, in my view. And I think this is why you're getting this talk, in the hope that just to realise the richness of what it means to be a penitent and going back. And I think what would be impossible to do, a bit like with the rules for the brothers, we needed also the other instructions from Francis. And we have 2 of those. We have what used to be called the letter to all the faithful, because it was thought that it was an exhortation and admonition to basically all Christians. It was only later on that it became specifically, bear in mind religious now covers penitence, that it had it more specific in one way, less specific in others, but basically we also have the first admonition and exhortation of Francis, which is much shorter. So as with the rule of the brothers, without having the earlier rule, without having the Testament, without having the writings of Francis, you would have a judicial document, a prescriptive document, a document that is guarding you against heresy, that is setting up for, you're even told, what to do when people die, what to do when people, how you support people within the community. All of that is laid down restrictively, but with it, you have the 2 writings of Francis. And that's what gives us the spirituality, the Franciscan tone. I'm just going to quick word, Charlie, how are we doing?
I think it's about 10.
So, do you want to
No.
continue? Okay.
Go right.
Okay, so basically, the earlier exhortation and the later exhortation, those are not our rules, but they are the understanding in which we need to apply the rule. So just to give a little kind of any questions, any comments, anything you'd like more clarification about? Then we're going to look very briefly at the other documents and Supramonte. So Paula's having a stretch. You can do if you like, or whatever. Well, either you've all gone to sleep or it was clear. I know what I like to think.
Can I just make a comment about penance?
Yeah.
I think you're right. And people like Richard Raw remind us that metanoia literally means bigger mind. So it talks about change of heart, but it's also a change of mind, and that's I think that's an invitation to see the world utterly differently from the way we have. And I think sometimes penitence, where we say sorry for our sins, we just end up in a never-ending loop because we never actually see the world differently. And I love the phrase in one of those things, which the penitent sees the world as belonging to God and all creatures. And yes. I think that's what we often miss with our narrow understanding of penitence, that we continue to just live for ourselves and just think penance is about, as we keep telling the young people in the Pacific, no sex, no swearing, and no drinking, which they all immediately ignore. But actually seeing the world utterly differently, metanoia, that then changes the heart and we live utterly differently. So you're exactly right. But I think that bigger mind which is what metanoia literally means, is a really important part of that.
Thank you for that, yes. Yeah. And I think just what you said and what I said, confession is me looking for forgiveness, just me. Not really about, I mean, I might confess all sorts of things, our social and everything else, but fundamentally, it's not sort of, whereas this wider, as you say, and all of the penitents would basically be starting with this prayer, you know, the prayer. The conversion apart from prayer goes side by side, don't they? You can't really, you know, you can't really bring about, in our belief, you need the grace of God. So they both go hand in hand. And that's really what leads, if you really do look at, I mean, I always remember it's 1 Chelano 6 where Francis gets this overwhelming reaction to the love of God. And he's so aware that he is loved, he, a sinner, is loved. And for me, that's what prompts him all of his life, because he wants everybody to know that they can have that absolute love of God, whoever they are. So embracing the leper is another extension of that. But basically, it's that God loves me. Wow, who am I? Look at me, look at God. Then the world and creation, and then seeing God as our creator, as brothers and sisters. It follows. But as I say, it's not, Francis, I think, makes it more specific. And because of Blood Out to Sea, because of what we're doing, but I think it had to be there for all of the penitents, that you are thinking much wider than it. I'll just go through a little bit more here. So with the Memorial in Propositi, it was probably Ugolino who did produce the words such as it was, and it was the church's official response to the need for a more organized structure for penitents as various fraternities were springing up throughout Italy. But again, this would have been Ugolino influenced by 1215. And we do know, well, I'm increasingly convinced that Ugolino had to be there to help Francis to see not only the need for these documents, but also he was very concerned, this is an aside, he was concerned when Francis left Italy for any length of time. Because what you have is a massive bunch of men who've joined the friars, who've had no probation, no preparation, and they are, as well as being broadened by being a penitent, some became, oh, I want to work with lepers. I think we should be monastic. I think we should be this. I think we should be eremitical. So Ugolino, I think, could always see where Francis, maybe this for the moment, maybe this was the situation he's in, but Ugolino was very, very apprehensive. And we know that he stopped him going to some places. We know that nature stopped him from going to some places. But we know that that year, when he goes off to the Holy Land and comes back, and he will then withdraw from being Minister General of the Order, that came back to huge division. These divides with where should the order go were very, very apparent. And so Ugolino, I have mixed feelings about Ugolino, but basically he was impressed by this group of people. He wanted them to continue, but he was giving the sort of official line. And he saw the dangers. And I think saw the dangers of the chaotic order, that in fact it was. So much so that when he is Pope, and when the brothers are, not long after the death of Francis, the brothers have to keep turning to the Pope because they can't resolve. The advantage of having a spiritual document and a rule is that we can enter into the spirit of Francis and what he wanted. The disadvantage is where they clash. And where the brothers can't resolve it, they will go to the Pope, they will go to the church, and the church will say, no, you follow the rule. The testament for your conscience, to help you understand Francis, but no, it is the rule that you follow. But it was the brothers who kept going to the Pope. So again, in a way, a little bit the same for us. We are surviving because you have this Memoriale Propositi that continues up until 1289. So Ugolino was, and it always seems to me, when I look at the history of the order, without the church behind them, they would have not survived because they were conforming and trying to live within the church. People kept saying, we've lost the spirit, the intention, and the ideals of the founder, and it is ever thus. Okay, we're still 800 years on, but we still have little groups. We still have loads of Franciscans all over the place that don't follow the rules. I don't know so much the Anglican Church, but certainly during the Catholic Church.
Yes.
You do too?
Yes.
Now those ones have to get permission from the bishop, and they will be able to work within that bishop's area, but they don't have the approval of the whole order. Okay, so we'll go back to here. So this is really just a summary of what was in this. So dress was important, abstinence and fasting, prayer. Now again, all of the Memoriale Propositi will encourage you to join in the liturgy of the hours if you can, but that's not possible. But nearly all of them say, you will say so many Our Fathers, grace before meal, different times of the hours, but because Humiliati and Franciscans have clerics, so where you have somebody who's a cleric who hasn't joined the First Order, is part of the penitents, they will of course be following the full liturgy of the church. But you get the numbers of prayers. Of course we have more. Humiliati have 7, we have to say 12. But I mean, that's kind of what you expect. So ours again is a bit more detailed. All encouraging you to go to confession and receive the Eucharist. And I think one of the things that we'll come on to in a minute, but basically one of the things that Francis is saying is basically, if you do these things, you will automatically want to be part of the church. You'll want to be living part of that life. You will go to the sacraments, but you will bear fruit in what you're doing. Not bearing arms, again, I said that changed a little bit for us. Not taking oaths, and that, well, you're living in feudal society. And that would lead to quite a lot of local resentment. But it is something that they held on to. Penitents removed themselves from the service expected from the lords and masters. So sometimes it actually meant they had to change what they would have done. Okay. Right, was that be done? Okay, so what I'm going to go on to now, when we eventually got our new rule, which makes me a secular, and the TOR Franciscans have a new rule, which we'll talk briefly about tomorrow. We followed the TOR example to the extent that we said the rule should start with a writing of Francis. We made a slight diversion because we, humble penitents, decided that we needed to take both chapters of the earlier exhortation. So we took those who do penance and those who don't. But the TOR, in their wisdom, don't bother with the second chapter. But more of that a little bit tomorrow. But I just want to, so bear in mind, we've got the Memoriale Propositi, that's going to be taken out at different times, and we have these writings of Francis, which I think mostly people would agree have come from a request. There are lay people who've been influenced by the Franciscan preaching. They've followed what Francis said. They've wanted to change their lives. They may not be organised necessarily to have the Memorial Propositi, but they write to Francis, or they ask. It gets to Francis that they want something. And so what we think now is that the earlier exhortation might have been written 1215, 1216, 1217, quite early on. But the later exhortation we think is early 1220s. So basically, the earlier exhortation begins, these are the words of life and salvation concerning those who do penance. Whoever reads them and puts them into practice will find life and attain salvation from the Lord, in the name of the Lord. Now, I think Francis defines penance in the next bit. All those who love the Lord with their whole heart, with their whole soul and mind, with their whole strength, and love their neighbours as themselves, and hate their bodies with their vices and sins. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. And receive the body and blood of our Lord Jesus Christ and produce worthy fruits of penance is what penitents do. So to break that down, the great commandment. The bit about hate their bodies, I think we get a little bit, I got a little bit hung up with that, but he doesn't just say hate their bodies. He says hate their bodies with their vices and sins. So what it is basically it's with our body that we commit sin. Well, it can be mind or whatever, you're including that as all part of it. But he's not saying, because I mean, I think when I first read it, I thought Francis was very ascetical. Francis ended up calling his body brother ass. We know that Claire also is very ascetical. But we see now that Francis changes because he apologizes to brother body. But he also insists that Claire has a minimum of food, a minimum size bread every day. So also, if you think of the story when somebody was craving, really hungry in the middle of the night, and Francis said, let's get up and eat. So when it's saying hate their bodies, I would have initially thought the whole thing, but it's not. It's hate the bodies because that is what we will do simple acts with. So that one. Where he says receives the body and blood of our Lord Jesus Christ, for me that's a short term of the sacraments and the church. But why the body and blood of our Lord Jesus Christ? Well, doesn't it still cause divides? But in those days, there was a time when nearly all Christians and Catholics, well, Catholics at the time, nearly all Christians were not sure about the Eucharist. And there was a period of kind of seeing God as divine, as high, as up there. And the Cathars, which is a strong heresy, Albigensians, will particularly challenge this. How can God be in something that is, and there are all sorts of extraordinary things. One that sticks in my mind, well, of course, Jesus was born out of the year. Couldn't have been born in the other one. But there was as there was a penitential movement, there was a general period of God is to be adored. I think the closest we would get to it would maybe be when we have the monstrance, and people are just, praying before that. So I think that's why he chose receive the body and blood of Christ instead of listing all the sacraments. And one of the things that the friars will do is they will really bring people back to not only receiving the Eucharist, but care. Francis's care for churches, care for the tabernacles, care for the bits of, and there may be something from the Bible in the Bible, care for all of that. So basically, also, again, Lateran Council 4. because Lateran Council 4 insists that you receive the body and blood of Christ. I think it's 3 times a year. But it's, to me, he's chosen that because that is, if you like, where people are doubting, unsure. And certainly admonition 1 of Francis is totally devoted to the Eucharist. And we know that it's in other parts of his writings as well. And that he is overwhelmed, you know, like the humility of Christ in the host, being held by human hands. So we know that Francis has the 3 aspects of humility, the incarnation, the Eucharist, the passion of the Eucharist. So Francis and Franciscans do play quite a large part of their ministry is encouraging people to receive the Eucharist. So, but for me, read that as be a member of the church. The next one, really, I see that he believes is consequential. If you love the Lord with all your heart, your whole soul, your mind, your strength, and your neighbours as yourselves, you're bound to be a person of prayer. You're bound to be in close relationship, the plumb line. You're trying to be in direct relationship with God. Being aware of, I mean, Francis will say that really it's the body that sins. He said it in this, but he says it in his admonitions as well. So if you are already trying to do that, you're obviously then responding to the gospel as well. If you then are faithful to the church, you will, he says, and produce worthy fruits of penance. But I think that means that actually if you do these things, a consequence of it will be that you produce worthy fruits of penance. And for me, that remains a summary. That is what we penitents are asked to do. So that is the beginning of the earlier exhortation, which is quite a short document. Just out of interest, how many of you access the early sources or use the website to access them? No. I keep saying this everywhere I go. You should. We have a free resource that we can use, and it's amazing. So basically, I've already mentioned quite a few, but just note admonition 1, just note the earlier exhortation and admonition, the Testament, of course, but I feel like I bang my head against a wall with my own. And I keep saying, have you accessed the sources yet? Have you accessed the sources yet? Anyway, also the fact that you can use them. You have that there, you can cut and paste, you can use them in your, as long as you refer them as you would to any other book. So basically, all there. So the earlier admonition, that is for me, the summary of the use of penance. Then he goes on to how happy and blessed are these men and women when they do these things and persevere in doing them, since the Spirit of the Lord will rest upon them, he will make his home and dwelling among them. They are children of the Heavenly Father, whose works they do. They are spouses, brothers, and mothers of our Lord Jesus Christ. We are spouses when the faithful soul is joined to our Lord Jesus Christ by the Holy Spirit. We are brothers to him when we do the will of the Father who is in heaven. We are mothers when we carry him in our heart and body through divine love, a pure and sincere conscience, and when we give birth to him by our holy manner of living, which should shine before others as an example. To me, this is, if you are leading a life of penance, then this is what's going to happen. And you see how much it's just echoing the gospel, and particularly John's gospel, a close reference to that. How glorious, how holy it is to have a Father in heaven, how holy, consoling, beautiful, and wondrous it is to have such a spouse. And how holy and how loving, pleasing, humble, peaceful, sweet, lovable and desirable above all things, to have such a brother and such a son, our Lord Jesus Christ, who gave up his life for his sheep, and who prayed to the Father, saying, Holy Father, protect those in your name who you have given to me in the world. They were yours, and you have given them to me. And the words which you gave to me I have given to them, and they have accepted them, and have believed truly that I have come from you, and they have known that you sent me. I pray for them and for myself. Bless and sanctify them, and I sanctify them myself for them. Not only for these do I pray, but for those who through their words will believe in me, so that they may be made holy in being one as we are. And I wish, Father, that where I am, they also may be with me, so that they may see my glory in your kingdom. Total quotes from John's last one. No, that's, you've got that, and you've got the memorial because of it. You need both. And that's where the TOR sensibly stop. We go on for the bit concerning those who do not do penance, and I'm not going to go through that with you. I can, but it would take another session. So that was the earlier, that was the simple, and that's the one that when we were asked by Vatican Council II, all of the orders were asked to go back to the founder. We have had, very much thanks to yourselves, the work of Sabatier, the work of Mormon, the work of so many, especially Anglican English scholars. And what did they do to the Catholics? That was positive. Come on, I'm being very open here. You can say quite honestly, what did that prompt the Catholics to do?
Respond.
Yes. So we have this manic search for sources. So thank you, because I think it is very much down to that work. And it was almost, to me, this is very bad, when I was an early student, it was like tit for tat, you know. We found that. Oh no, you find that. We found, no, you find that. But the grace of it was that many sources were unearthed. And the work that has been done, thank goodness, I think it's true to say there's none of that now. I'm not aware of any recent scholarship that has been, you said that, didn't it? But I think the work of the Anglicans has been amazing. And it's caused, as I say, but I think the search for sources might have happened anyway, but I believe, and I continue to believe, that was very much prompted by what was happening. And basically, in all of the work that's been done on the sources, you will find, I think you find that we need, for me, we need to get back, I would say, to start with the legend of three companions. And I say that because the legend of three companions is written by people from Assisi who knew Francis and who, if you like, it was our hero made good. You know, he was our local guy and he did all these things. And you get things in the legend of three companions that you don't get in one Chilani. Also, it's short. So, well, to me, that's a bonus. And it will be, you know, it's surprising that you don't get the San Damiano Cross event in Chilana, but you do get it in the Legends of the Companions. So there are things that are very, very valuable within that. And also this idea that Francis would not be in court before the magistrates, but would be, that all comes from the Legends of the Companions. So we have these sources. And for me, the value of getting more familiar with the writings of Francis, I think it just reinforces this total love he has, that the scriptures are so much part of it, but also I think his understanding and depth in contemplation in the Eucharist and understanding and making us realize we should find this more accessible. I think that all of us sort of need to go spend a bit more time with the writings of Francis. The later exhortation, you can see the earlier exhortation is quite a contrast. You read it side by side. What happens in the later exhortation is that it's much longer, and that includes a lot of do's and don'ts. So it's not quite like the Memoriale Propositi, but it is saying a whole section is what should we do? How should we live our lives? So we worship him, we praise him and singing day and night, we confess our sins to a priest, we receive the Eucharist, we perform worthy fruits of penance, we love our neighbours and self, but it was on, if there's anyone who does not wish to love them as himself, at least let him do no harm to them, but rather good. You get that in Our Father as well. And for me, that's one of the really go-to Franciscan friendship. You may, if you cannot, if you're really in a difficult situation in terms of forgiveness, well, ask God to forgive them. Don't do any harm, that minimum. So it's very practical. If you receive the power to judge others, exercise with mercy. Judgment will be without mercy for those who haven't shown mercy. Have charity, humility, give alms. Fast and abstain. Visit churches frequently. Venerate, show respect for the clergy. And again, Francis and the church are aware of many clerical failings, but Francis always values a priest. And he will not say that priest has committed the sin, so he shouldn't be giving the Eucharist. At that time, God is working in that priest. If there are sinners, let them repent of the sin and come back to the sacraments. So it's a very long list of do's and don'ts. And that kind of, it's not as restrictive as Memoriale Propositi, but it is, this is how we, it's like if they've come back and had this earlier exit and said, yeah, but that's not enough to help us, that's fine, that's spiritual, but we actually want some do's and don'ts about what we'll be doing. But at the heart of medieval documents, it often is literally the center of a document. And for that reason, I think we need to be aware that what Francis talks about in the center of the later exhortation is about humility. It's about service. It's about how we must be simple, be humble, be pure. Never desire to be above others. Obey the ones that are placed above us. Show mercy as he would wish them to show mercy with them. Don't become angry. Love our enemies. Do good to those who hate us. So this sort of never desire to be above others, be servants and subject to every human creature for God's sake. That, I think, is the heart. And you find that heart in the middle of the later admonition and exhortation. And the second letter, the second part of it is very much a repetition. But to me, that this was, we want do's and don'ts. So we've got do's and don'ts in that second section. So that's as far as we get with Francis. We have the earlier exhortation, we have the later exhortation. We know the Memoriale Propositi is in place. I've told you that there are 4 versions that we can read of the Memoriale Propositi between 1221 and 1289. Because 1289 is when we have the first rule for the Franciscan penitents. So we've gone from the Propositum, which was for a local group, although they'd all be handed the same thing. Those letters are available as far as they will be to anyone who has access to them. But basically the letters are written for everyone. One thing he does say in the second letter is he talks about the state of his health. And he's sorry that he's not well enough to visit people. Because and that also helps us date it as probably when he came back. And just another aside, I'm convinced that when Francis is no longer able to be minister of the order, and I believe he went through a very dark time. I believe he went through a very uncertain time. Some of that, I think, would have been part of the learning experience. But I also believe that because he's not Minister General, but he remains spiritual leader, that's the time you get all the writing. So if you go back to his writings, you will see a lot dated 1220, post 1221. He's come back from the Holy Land, and he is writing to rulers. He's not writing just to people in the church. They're short, but a lot of it is about Eucharist. A lot of it is being faithful. So those writings kind of, that's where I think the later admonition invitation comes from, that period of time. So we get then to, well, why was it 1289? Well, okay, we have a Franciscan Pope. It's a Franciscan Pope who will give the rule to the brothers. Okay, maybe the penitents are saying we want something that is for everybody. I think the reason is because there has been a very difficult period for the Franciscans in the century. I think it started in 1228 when the brothers don't know whether to believe, go by the testament or go by the rule. They start turning to the church. That is a pattern. That pattern will happen. You also get and out of that you get the need for training. You get all sorts of good things come out of that. But one of the things that increasingly happens in the 13th century is that the mendicants and the seculars are in confrontation. By this time, the secular clergy do not want the itinerant preachers who by now build churches, say masses for people. People get buried in their cemeteries. Often people choose to go to the friars rather than go to the main churches. And you have a very difficult period, culminating in yet another council, the Council of Leon. And at the Council of Leon, the seculars really want all mendicants to be disbanded. But you have Bonaventure and you have Thomas Aquinas. And basically you have, it starts in Paris, and that's where you have most of the difficulty. But by the time we get, Bonaventure is elected Minister General. The reason also that we get a request for a new life to be written, discontent, different ways of practicing. So the 13th century is difficult. But at the period of the Council of Leon in 1274, the seculars really want no more mendicants. The apology for mendicants that comes from a combination of Dominicans and Bonaventure is basically what's used and keeps it going. And so in 1274, you again could have lost the orders. Several smaller orders are disbanded. That means they're told, you can go on until the people that belong to you die, but you can't have any more new people come. You also have the beginning of the spiritual movement. You've got the beginning of another eschatological fear, another period when people are thinking the end of the world's coming. And I think those are the reasons that we have Nicholas appealed to give a greater security to the penitents. And so we get Supramontem. And Supramontem is 1289. And again, I'm only going to take very few sections from this, but very early on it says, all who may happen to take upon themselves the observance of this form of life before undertaking the section be subjected to a diligent examination of the Catholic faith and obedience to the foresaid church. And if they have firmly the faith and obedience and truly believe in them, they may be safely admitted. right? So on the positive side of that, if you are in an order, then you're going to be protected by the church. The negative side of that is suspicion. So there's still fear that as penitents you're going to go into heresy. But it is only in this particular rule that we get the recognition that this is addressed to the Franciscan brothers and sisters of penance. So 1289, unlike the Memorial Propositi, is designed, it's addressed to the brothers and sisters, the Franciscan brothers and sisters of penance. And so that is the first, and it's universal. So 1289 is the first rule of the church for them. And as I said to you, the change in bearing arms, because what it says is, unless in defense of the Roman Church, the Christian faith, or the country, or with permission of the ministers. That's not bearing arms. I think you've probably had enough. Am I right? You've done very well. I could go on, but I think probably that's sufficient. Okay. Obviously, any more questions or comments apart from lengthy and hot? Yes.
The admonitions, the title admonitions rather put me off ever reading them. So having penetrated the title, they don't seem at all admonitory. Is the term, does it mean something different?
As I understand admonish, this isn't, I'm willing to greater authorities, this is just from experience. I think an admission is when you are, perhaps you see something that is possibly an error. And what do you do about it? You admonish your brother. You don't sort of attack him or, really, but you're looking out. It's like a warning. Be careful. That's how I see it now. I'm prepared to be corrected and given a much better definition. But I see it's sort of a warning. Be careful. This is the way you might be going. So admonition is that side, and exhortation is the encouragement side.
There's a lot of positivity in them, isn't there?
Yes.
When you look at the first admonition,
yes,
about the Eucharist,
yes,
that's tremendously positive and affirmative about the Eucharist and being with Jesus.
And I also think that when you write a letter to the minister, and that's for the one when the minister wants to go, leave the fraternity, basically that sort of talks about no, you're not leaving. Stay with the brothers, work it out. And the encouragement would be admonish. And I think, again, that actually becomes more positive. So you're not just going to go, oh, I'm going to go to superior, blah, blah. You actually, the idea is let's sit and have a talk. What's going on? What's wrong here? So I think it is. But I must admit, you're not alone. But then I didn't like the first letter to the faithful, the second letter to the faithful either. And there's a whole debate. There was one, I haven't written in my notes, but there was one huge title about 2 sentences long that somebody was going to give to it. There was quite a debate over what to call it. In the day, Esther and that time when we're getting a lot of scholarship. In the end, this is the best. Let's try and keep to that. So yes, I agree with you. It was off-putting. I thought, could you do
a real
it?
steel in it, isn't there? There's
Yes.
things that make you sit up and think.
There are. But as I say, I think for me, I prefer admonition 1. I think it's simple. I didn't read out the bit about when it talks about the word of God, the Annunciation. It's very short with reading. The second one is much more, this is what you do. And I can see people want that. It's all very well having this, but give me something concrete. And I think a bit like the brothers, this is fine, but let's have something concrete that we can do. So thank you for that. You're not alone.
We have a bit of Anglican history to throw in here.
Oh,
Those of you who were ordained under the 1662 Book of Common Prayer, there are still, but anyway, that the ordering of priests there talks about how priests are to teach and to premonish
Pre-Monish.
where you didn't provide for the etc. So pre-Monish is in the 1662 Common
But I suppose you couldn't have premonition because that has a different.
It's not, that's a different.
It's a different set, doesn't
warning in advance.
Yes, but that's better than, I prefer that to admonish, but
Yeah.
premonition wouldn't,
Yeah.
wouldn't work, yeah. But I like that, premonish.
One of the theories I've heard about the genesis of the admonitions was at the chapters of Maths, when an issue would come up, Francis would get up and say, wow, and Brother Leo or someone would be writing it down, so that these were responses to issues which were coming up in the chapter. Not that I know issues for us don't come up. So their admonitions in terms of, well, this is going on.
I think the chapters were very much designed to share your experience, but also I think some people met Francis, but I think it was almost like confession. You know, we did this and it didn't work. We did that and it did work, and sort of coming to. I think that's why we're so lucky to have the earlier rule.
Two comments I made. That bit that you said about being subject to every creature is also in France's earlier rule, I think, where he's talking about going among the Saracens.
That's right.
It's interesting that phrase is in there still,
Yes.
how they're to live.
Yeah.
My other comment is to do with that change, the 12, whatever it was, with the Council of Lyon.
Yeah,
but
1274.
And I'm wondering about what else was going on in the wider society. And one of the things that Bill Short brought out in an online thing that we did with Durham University a couple of years ago was how the merchants were attracted to Francis and the early Franciscans because they understood that dilemma of the merchants was how they weren't really fully accepted by the church and were uncertain of their salvation. And so they funded the Franciscans and built their own churches, which weren't parish churches. And so here you get the beginnings of that later conflict of the Franciscan independent churches sort of thing and the parish churches. And it was to do with that sense of, because merchants practice usury, they weren't assured of salvation. And Francis, with his background as a merchant's son, understood that.
Yeah, and I think that's quite, I think you're quite right. That will have continued because trading is continuing more and more. Certainly, that sense of merchants almost being damned is kind of there even in the early period. I think that's a valid, very valid point. In terms of things going on in the rest of the world, I mean, I think when the Franciscans in particular, you've now got widespread communities and you have got communication. And this is again a personal thing. It's not from the sources, but it's a personal thing. Greccio seems to become quite a hotbed. And if you think of Greccio as being very, very remote, and also it's convenient in the sense that it's on the way to Rome. And you have basically, I think, among some of the proto-spirituals, you get this sort of coming together, telling the stories, and then being taken kind of a bit too far from it. And so I think sort of the communication, and somewhere like the marches, there is a lot of discontent that we've moved away from Francis. So I think not only the marches, but those routes that are used. And so you're getting questioning from people who've been to one part of the world to another part of the world, but also getting a kind of reinforcing what I think. And I sort of imagine just the stories that would have been told. Now, you'll talk a little about the Hermitage later, but it's just a feeling it gives me, and very often the friars who are in error are imprisoned in Friary, and you have a place at Greccio, the hole that was used for that. So I think the trade routes are very significant, and yes, I think the merchants wanting to be sure of salvation, definitely.
clicks or changes on my slides, unlike Paula, is much more disciplined. So I'm either going to look like a chicken pecking or that I'm having a seizure I thought of doing the presentation from the back so I wouldn't burn Mikhail, but I guess this is recording as well, or this the speaker, yeah. And then I wouldn't see which one of you are drifting off asleep either. Even though I'm like a Zen master, I did do some Zen study in a Chinese monastery that's actually in New York City. And they had that custom of the keeper in the Zendo of if somebody dozed off, you get a whack on the back of the stick. So I won't do that, I promise. This week, actually just this past Friday, I had a dental appointment very near the Franciscan Mother House, founding place in a way of our lifestyle in the Americas, at Little Portion Friary, which is where many of the brothers are buried and many tertiaries are buried, and also the Poor Clares are buried here, the American Poor Clares. So since I was in the area and I knew I was coming here, I thought I'd go make a little pilgrimage and said a prayer at Father Joseph's grave, Father Joseph, our American founder, with the idea of the sources, because though I've often heard him written off with a kind of straw dog of being a spiky Anglo-Catholic, he was someone with a profound sense of the Franciscan sources, a very, I don't know how, very sophisticated modern sense of the sources. So when we were founded in 1915, a little before the English, he did not, as you might expect a spiky Anglo-Catholic, just take the rule of the then current secular Franciscans in the Roman Church. He gave us the Propositum Memoriale Propositum, the 1221 rule, an adaptation. He wrote about it. He said, why should I adapt what's an adaptation? We should go back to the sources. So our rule for the first 50 years of our province was the first rule, adapted. And the 12 chapters of the tertiary rule in the Americas followed the 12 chapters of the Memoriale. And for the brothers, their rule, as you might suspect, as Christopher John and I discovered when we were rooting around the archives, was, as I suspected, the rule of the Friars Minor, their confirmed rule. So yes, he was a spiky Anglo-Catholic, but he had a sense of our history and the importance of sources, which was highly unusual. Certainly 1915, my goodness. The last time I was together with Margaret Carney via Zoom, one of my St. Bonaventure classmates, she shared the story that I witnessed of when a third order scholar came to the Franciscan Institute, where they were in St. Bonaventure, where there are all these great Friar Minor scholars, and Raphael Pazzelli, the great third order scholar, who was a character. He had a very silky, satiny habit, and I always picture Raphael with a cigarette in one hand and a martini in the other. He was the great starter of all the stuff that Paula spoke about. And he told this group, in the chapel no less, of scholars, that yes, Francis was a penitent, and the penitents came first. It was almost a brawl. Because most of them, even though these are people who were translating Duns Scotus and translating the first, because when I was in school was when the first critical edition of Esser came out, which shows how old I am. They had never heard any of this. So it was shocking. So how Father Joseph got it in 1915, I haven't figured out yet, but it's pretty amazing. So sources have always been important for us. And as I said, I'm going to take a broad sense of source. So I'm going to look at documents, but I'm also going to look at places and maybe lifestyle to look at this balance that has always been a struggle for Franciscans between action and contemplation. And so Paula very well covered what was going on with the penitents, and I'll touch on that just. And I'll also look at among the friars minor. I'm going to use the term friars minor and penitent because I think our use of first order, third order is kind of confusing when you look where we fit on a family tree. I think we're, I didn't know whether I'd say this now, but my gut feeling is that we are third order and third order regular in our roots. So I'm even more biased toward the penitents. So I'm supposed to talk till when?
Calm down.
Now, those who know me know that's possible. I'm going to set a timer because I'm not as disciplined as Paula. So I should, when are we supposed to end? Because we have those,
12:30.
12:30. So I'll try, let me set this. Is 12:15 a good time? All right, well, you know what, I'll put it for an hour. I have a professor that told me the mind can only absorb what the butt can take. So we'll try that. All right. I understand that this topic came up from stuff that the ministers were hearing in their provinces about contemplation and action and how to do that. And I think this is a picture of Grand Central Station, New York City, which is the least contemplative place. One of them, maybe I've been in Tokyo, that probably comes even more worse than this, and symbolizes what our current world is, this busy, 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 busy place, totally being available. Now, this is my own pet peeve, I have people on the staff who I've had to tell that now that they have Apple Watches, so you'll be talking to them, and they're like, oh, don't answer the message. It's getting worse and worse, isn't it? So the idea of setting aside a block of time for nothing is like a modern heresy in our culture. So how did those first Franciscans make this balance? What did the balance look like for them? Now, just like the Memoriale or the confirmed Friar Minor rule or the rule for hermitages or any of these things aren't for us necessarily prescriptive. Like Paula says, you have, especially for us, Anglican Franciscans, you have to have our documents and the writings of Francis in our two hands when we try to figure out what are we to do. But they give us an idea, at least where our movement and tradition that we try to claim started and a starting point. It's not really proscriptive or prescriptive. So I hope from what I share, and it's going to just come out as it comes out, but as I thought about this, there's a group of characteristics of the Franciscan approach to contemplation, or to that and that blend of action that I hopefully will come out. I haven't got it very systematically. This is kind of a work in progress. So, solitude, fraternity. Now I'm using the term our sisters in the third order regular used. That when you try to describe it, sorority or fellowship or other things, it's like poverty. I've had some of our tertiaries in our province say, can't we get rid of the word obedience? Or can't we get rid of the word poverty? Well, it's hard to get another word that bears the weight of our tradition and is as rich. You know, so it's kind of fraternity is a very Franciscan word, and we don't have a good neutral word that says it in a very recognizably Franciscan way. So I've chosen fraternity. Simplicity. Thank you. Oh, my glasses. Rhythm. So there's a rhythm to the prayer. The office, in some form, some way of praying at set times or at formal times or designated times, has always been a part of our prayer. So there's a need for a rhythm of the day in prayer. Next, creation. Relationship with creation is an important part, is the context, in a sense, for the Franciscan life of prayer. And finally, strive to be like him. Hopefully you recognize those words from anyone? St. Clare, right? Clare's adaptation of the model of Lectio. You know, gaze on him, contemplate him, consider him, and strive to be like him. So that sense of living the gospel in order to be like Christ, which is where the action comes in. Right? So Franciscan prayer begins action. All right, I'm gonna have to go around this one. Since my eyes want to read it. These are some quotes. How's that? Yeah. I can't read that one. You can move on to any monastery you wish, where you'll find impressive buildings, delicate foods served according to their seasons. There too you will meet the great expanses of land covered with flocks. Here you will find only poverty and the cross. There is no other rule than the gospel. Anyone who keeps it is a religious. Whoever strays from it lives outside the bounds of all rules and all orders. The last one. If God's Son would have known a better way than poverty for a person to gain heaven, he would surely have chosen it as his path. Love poverty then, for Jesus Christ chose it as the better part. So in today's Lectio, we heard that love poverty, right? So where in Francis's writings do you think these are? Where would you find them? Does it ring a bell for anybody?
It's the sacred thing with what's the title? The sacred one?
Sacrum Commercium.
Sacrum Commercium. Is it that one?
Well, that's a good guess.
Yeah.
I don't want to shame our brother minister. All right. Anyone? Any other brave souls?
Not after that.
All right. This is a nasty trick.
It's not Francis.
It's not Francis.
It's just Claire, isn't it?
No. Nick, he hit brother. This is Saint Stephen of Muret, who died 60 years before Francis was born. One of the other things that was going on at the time of the Order of Penitence was the movement of apostolic hermits. And Stephen of Muret was the founder of what became, because the first house or hermitage that they had was Grandmont. They were known as the Grandmontines. And they actually became pretty big. And they were wandering, preaching hermits who sought to live the gospel. And the values of this other movement, which paralleled and sometimes intersected, as we'll see, many of the penitents were hermits. and lived kind of a wandering or lived an itinerant life of pilgrimage. This was another of the influences, as I'll show, that influenced Francis. As Paula said, Francis, was not like Venus bursting from the head of Zeus. He did not drop down, even though he says, don't talk to me about Benedict and Bernard and Augustine. He used them. He did, because that was the idiom he had. So one of the other things, I think, was this apostolic movement of preaching wandering hermits, and the Grand Montines are a great example. So I want to talk a bit about these early aromatical elements and movements that preceded and were contemporaneous with the first Franciscans. So this is Stephen of Muret. And this, Jean Leclerc, who I got to meet once in Kalamazoo, Michigan, of all places, wrote this kind of groundbreaking book, The Love of Learning and the Desire for God. And those are our Holy Cross Anglican Benedictine brothers there in New York at West Park. And Leclerc's thing was that living the Benedictine lifestyle, living in a monastery, following the rule of Benedict, ora et labora, and that regular, led you to have a certain way of approaching God. That when Benedictines or Cistercians or anyone in that tradition would write, they approach God in a certain way. That Leclerc, in this really classical work, said was because of how they lived and their lifestyle formed their vision of God. So what I'm saying, and we'll see another example of it, is this apostolic aromatical / which to us, see, as Paula said a couple of times, we're much more rigid in the silos we put various lifestyles. You're a hermit. This is what you do. I'm an active missionary. This is what I do. That didn't exist. So this active aromatical tradition, I think, living that kind of a wandering lifestyle with a sense of apostolic ministry and also the importance of solitude, I think that formed the approach to God that the people, which is why there's such strong similarities between that prior movement and much of our early Franciscan writing and lifestyle, as we'll see. So Stephen of Grandmont, Stephen of Muret is almost, I've pulled that trick on many Franciscan, quoted some of Stephen's writings, and it's hard to tell it apart from Francis. That their approach to God was very, very similar. And I think it's because their lifestyle, the style they chose, it was not monastic. I know that's often something you get thrown at you if, some of our tertiaries will say, well, what do we have to say the office for? We're not monks. Well, no, we're not monks. But we do come from a tradition that values regular prayer in the course of the day, most often in the prayers of Christ, the Psalms. So I'm going to say, and this is my own, so take it for what it's worth, that we are also, in our early tradition, formed by the same type of lifestyle. And one of the reasons our early forebears wrote the way they did was because of this lifestyle. Okay, so here's an example. Let everyone have all things in common. As it is written, no one kept anything as his own. So The monastic, Cenobitical, Benedictine tradition will look very much to this text in the scriptures, right? And the rule of Benedict is very much founded on. The Eremitical tradition will look to this quote. If you would be perfect, go sell what you possess, give to the poor, and you'll have treasure in heaven. That was the conversion text for Anthony of Egypt and the Desert Fathers and Mothers, who will be important, very important for us, because Francis, as we'll see, came to be venerated as a desert father. And notice what text for us as Franciscans would fit more and was more referred to and was key in Francis's own conversion. I should have brought some pictures from Sassetta's life, or his painting of the life of Anthony of Egypt, and his painting of the life of Francis. And it would be hard for you to tell which one it was he was talking about. Of course, Celano, structure of First Celano was based on the life of Anthony of Egypt for various reasons. One of the reasons being they were still in the stage of proving that Francis was a saint. Athanasius's Life of Anthony was the bestseller of the time and the model for all biographies of saints. So if Celano wanted people to pick up his book and say, oh, this is a saint, he modeled it on Anthony's life so that people would right away know, oh, this is a book about saints. But there are parallels too, like this. This is so Anthony heard this as his call to vocation. Go sell what you have, give to the poor. And he did exactly that and went off, much like our own Stratford Father. So that's another parallel. Next. This is Romuald, who was part of that earlier apostolic movement, maybe the best known. He is the founder of the still existing Camaldolese. So he's the founder of the Camaldolese hermits. This is a look at their spirituality. Now just think of this as written by a contemporary Camaldolese. So smallness, communities of Camaldolese were supposed to be small, not get big, huge things, sprawling communities with many hundreds of members. They were supposed to stay like 10 at most. That was because their other value was poverty. You can't, it's easier to have poverty if there's 10 of you living on a mountain than if there's 100 of you. So the two went together. And these are things we'll see in our early movement as well. Next. The mission of love. So love was the greatest value for Romuald and the first Camaldolese. And their mission was to spread love. Now, that would seem to us, because of our silos, an odd thing. If your mission was love, why would you go say you're going to live a life of a hermit? You got to be out doing things. Well, yes, we do, but in a certain way. Next. All right, the triple good. So this is, now they talk very much about this triple good that Camaldolese currently. And it's always been their thing. And it was written by one of Romuald's friends, St. Bruno Boniface, who wrote the only biography we have of Romuald, where we find one of the copies of his brief rule, which is just 3 or 4 paragraphs long. And it's a beautiful thing on contemplative life. Sit in your cell as in paradise and forget all the world. Wait there for God like a chick who waits only on what its mother brings. Just a beautiful little piece of writing. And so in this And he also wrote, and this is where, again, the paradox is. So it was a little life of Romuald and the story of the 5 missionary Camaldolese. Get that? Missionary Camaldolese hermits who were martyred and were the first Camaldolese saints. So he wrote this triple good, which is still at the heart of their spirituality. Next. Koinonia, community, the importance of community. For us, that value of fraternity. Solitude, community, but also solitude, that paradox. And finally, evangelization. In the original, it was martyrdom, because those 5 missionary brothers were martyred. And the desire for martyrdom is how, in that period, remember this is the 12th century, this is about 100 or so years before Francis. Martyrdom, the desire for martyrdom, was the equivalent of evangelization. You desire to be a martyr. That's the way they often spoke of it. So we see that with Francis, we see that with Anthony of Padua, our first teacher. He desired martyrdom and desperately tried to get to Africa to be martyred, which meant to evangelize. His vocation came from seeing the relics of the first Franciscan martyrs. So evangelization. So again, you wouldn't think, we normally in our very boxy minds, compartmentalized minds, wouldn't think that the current and the ancient values of the Camaldolese hermits are community, solitude, and evangelization. Now I asked Peter if that would sound familiar. Next. This comes from the writing on, I think was this in ongoing formation or a lot, this is used in a lot of our current work, right? So contemplation, community, and missional action sound somewhat similar to community, solitude, and evangelization. So I think this is another bubbling up of this ancient source in the church, like the penitent movement was, the eremitical desert movement as well. Here we're still talking about the same values that Romuald was talking about in the 12th century, and which I think are very Franciscan. And that's the trick. And that's the trick for the Camaldolese still, because I know a lot of them, is how do you have those values of community and solitude and evangelization? Even though they live in a hermitage, it's still a task. How do you do that? Next. So one of the things this movement gave was a physical structure called the Laura. This is St. McCarron, who I think had the first Laura. And it was a physical way these communities of wandering hermits were structured. Now, this style from the Desert Fathers, of course, made it to Ireland. So some of you will recognize this is Skellig Michael, which was a Laura, modeled on this ancient structure of the Desert Fathers and Mothers. This is a map of Skellig Michael. And you can see you have the oratory in the church, and then you have individual cells where the monks, the hermits, would go for most of their time at the Laura, at the hermitage, clustered around maybe a common place for eating and a place for common worship when they would come together during the day for the office and for Eucharist. But otherwise, they spent time in their cells. So it's this kind of blend. Next. This is El Greco's painting of Camaldoli, and there's Romuald and Benedict. And there you see the pattern of the Laura, right? You see the central church and all the individual cells. Next. This is just a close-up of this picture of Camaldoli. Next. This is Camaldoli today. This is the Sacro Remo at Camaldoli, which was one of Francis's favorite places. So if you go to Camaldoli, they will point to the cell, which obviously is not the actual one, because these are built much later, probably on the old foundations, as the cell of St. Francis. And he often went there on retreat, and there were Camaldoli's hermits as well, San Silvestro, on Mount Sabasio. There was a community of Camaldoli's right there. So it's a tradition he was very familiar with. Next. This is the current American in Big Sur, where I go on retreat. I can actually see the cell they graciously give me. This is in Big Sur, which is probably actually their prior general said the most remote Camaldoli's place, and I'll attest to that. It's not easy to get to. So here is the
Especially after a rainstorm.
That's right.
All the blood comes down.
I just got out once and had to drive around boulders and that, and the monk said, well, when you get to Carmel, call us so we know you got out. And so here, this was built in the 50s and 60s. You see the same Laura pattern. And next, this is the Reformed Camaldoli's, just like we have Reformed Cistercians with the Trappists and Reformed Friars Minor with the Capuchins. There are Reformed Camaldoli's. And this is in Ohio. That was the hardest presentation I ever gave, was to these. Looking at a bunch of 15 hermits, what was I going to tell them? So again, here's the ancient pattern. Next slide. Here's another hermitage. Anybody guess? Oh, go back. It's the Porciuncula.
Yeah.
So it's hard to get a real good modern. You would think by now. I'm almost tempted to get somebody to do it instead of this ancient kind of Victorian engraving. But this was what the Porciuncula looked like. And this is the way all the early Franciscan hermitages look like. Now, many of them incorporated caves. The Porciuncula, in a way, is unique in that it's down on a plain. The row of trees that currently is in front of the Porciuncula is meant to be a reminder of the woods that surrounded the Porciuncula. Now, the Franciscan model would have been different, that it was specified that the enclosure, and there was an enclosure that people weren't allowed to come in, was made out of either it was a hedge or wattle and mud, and the cells were made out of wattle and mud. But otherwise, it was no different in structure than a laura. It was a laura. Franciscans. This is just a slide of Francis praying that the devils of Arezzo would be driven out. And it's kind of this idea of prayer and action being intimately connected, right? That we're struggling with here. And their sense of this might be different than ours, their lived experience. So the earlier rule says, wherever the brothers may be, either in hermitages or other places, let them be careful. Be careful not to make any place their own or contend with anyone in it. Whoever comes to them, friend or foe, thief or robber, let them be treated with kindness. So of course, this is related to one of those stories of the connection of service or evangelization and love of God with the robbers who went to the hermitage, and Francis came and found out the brothers had chased them off, and he got all ticked off, and he made them go and get them and bring them back, and Francis waited on them for dinner. But one of the things I want to point out is, notice what he says, whether in hermitages or other places. So though most of you are going to be in hermitages, there will be other places you might find yourself. Now, the bit about not claiming anything, that didn't last very long, did it? So even Francis, the one place Francis talks about is the hermitage of Porciuncula, which it's hard for us now to look at it and imagine it was a hermitage, but it was a hermitage. And that's the one place he said, never let anybody drive you out of this place. If they scare you out of one door, go back in the other door, right?
Charlie, on the slide, I don't know if it was drawn to scale or whatever, but where the Porciuncula was, it looked like the sort of cruciform pattern around it looked kind of like the edges of the current church, you know? I mean, like, yeah, I can look at that and sort of see, oh yeah, here's the.
Well, what is in that old engraving is the chapel, I guess, do they call it the Chapel of the Transitus?
Yeah, right to the right.
Would have been probably where the larger community building would have been. It would have made sense, like in those Lauras, they might have had a hut for eating, maybe, which might also be used for house chapters, and that might have been an infirmary hut. So you see it's separate, and there would have been a bunch of those around. Right?
I'm just saying that an act of imagination there isn't that.
Well, you're walking in the precincts of that.
Yeah.
But you'd have very little sense of that.
It doesn't.
When you're there now, in that bustling, big, gaudy place. So, all right, next slide. That's fine. This is interesting to show what we sometimes do to the sources to make us feel better. In the love of God, therefore, I beg all my brothers, those who preach, pray, or work, cleric or lay, to strive to humble themselves. Now, I've seen some translations. I have to admit, I don't know if I got this from Franciscan sources. I mean, the new books, or where I got it from. Because this is actually truer. Some of them have say, let all the brothers, whether they are praying, working, or preaching. What that sounds like is that everybody was doing everything. And they're all sort of equivalent. Or they were more, it was more generic. What it actually says, and I'll suffer to have the Latin. This is one of the few times I get to use my years of medieval Latin and Latin paleography. I've suffered through. Omnes fratres meos, predicatores, oratores, laboratores. So it's not whether you're preaching or it's those who are workers, those who are prayers, or those who are preachers. So again, there were brothers who were prayers, which means their main life was in the hermitage. And there were brothers who were preachers, and there were brothers who were workers. And he's talking about worker, like in our 60s, the worker priest movement, right? So if you look at, I'm getting mixed up if it's John Lateran or Maria Maggiore, which was redecorated by the first Franciscan Pope. Of course, the first Franciscan Pope went out and spent lots of money decorating Maria Maggiore. But what's interesting, and whichever one it is, I always get them mixed up, in the sides, you have a picture of Brother James, who was an architect. And tertiary brother, which slips my mind, who were the designers and architects of the mosaics. And we know from the civil documents of Assisi that many of the bridges built in the valley and around were built by Franciscan engineers and architects in the 13th century. So when they say workers, and the rule says, let them have the tools of their trade in regarding poverty. So there were people whose main job was architecture or building or artists or workers. There were friars, minor, whose main task was praying. And there were preachers. And they were all connected. And so that variety of lifestyle, which will ultimately become an issue, which one's better? And you see reflected in it our 3 ways of service, which I'll talk about, which really is going to be my focus tomorrow when I look at the principles. Are mirrored in this as well, right? In these identities. But what it shows is there were actually brothers whose main task was prayer formally. And then, of course, we have the rule for hermitages. I'm not going to go through the whole rule. In it, we see the sense of enclosure, of silence. We see fraternity in the care the 2 roles had, the mothers and sons. We see connection to the greater order in that the only one who can really come in, if I'm remembering right, who can speak to the sons is the minister. So the connection with the greater order. But that sense of, we don't think about enclosure. A lot of people have trouble with it. With Claire, I'm one of those that don't think she objected to enclosure because she was a tough broad. We know there were times if she didn't like something, she had no hesitation. In her letter to Agnes, she said, well, you have to respect someone in authority. And we know she's talking about the Pope. But you don't necessarily have to do what he tells you. And then when the friars said, well, we don't really want to deal with the Clares anymore. We're, they can't visit you. Basically, Claire gave a hunger strike. We won't eat unless you send the brothers to us. So she had no trouble speaking up. And of course, the famous one, the privilege of poverty, which literally she took to her grave. Never a word about enclosure. So a wise woman scholar said that. She would have said something if she really didn't want it, or mentioned it, or she wouldn't be shy about it. And Francis, obviously, was not afraid of the word enclosure either, or the use of enclosure, to protect solitude and silence, those values. The other thing that's embedded in this, as in all the early sources, the rhythm of prayer, the praying the office, coming together. As if you picture that image of the Portiuncle again, coming from their individual cells to the common chapel to pray together. Oh, blessed solitude, oh, solitary blessedness. This is not over some Benedictine monastery. This is over San Francesco nel Deserto, what was the hermitage on an island in Venice, in the lagoon of Venice, which was one of the places Francis started and went to. And it's called St. Francis in the Desert. Because as with the Celtic monks, desert didn't necessarily mean the physical desert. It was a wilderness place, a place alone, right? So they could, Skellig Michael was a desert. San Francesco del Deserto, in the middle of the Venice Lagoon, was a desert. Greccio, the Carceri, the surrounds of Laverna, the woods of Laverna. Could you go back to Greccio, or go back to the Carceri? It's fine. I must have, in my, I tried to be, as I said to Paula at one point in our discussions, I tried to be canonic and eliminate stuff. I eliminated some of the slides I thought in my mind I still had. But if you, what does this place, look at this, and go back one. Greccio, so these are two examples. Now, if we look at Greccio, Fonte Colombo, Specco d'Armi, La Foresta, the Carceri, certainly Laverna, they all kind of look like this. So would this be a place that a casual visitor would go to? Now, you have to remember that in most of these places like this, or you can go to the Carceri, most of what we're seeing is 14th century, 13th or 15th century rebuilding by many of the observant movements who sought to recapture this type of lifestyle. So imagine those huts or caves. They often wanted places with caves, so they wouldn't have to put all these huts, right? Greccio, certainly, you can see the caves of Francis. And what strikes me in Greccio is the first church dedicated to St. Francis, named St. Francis after he was canonized, on the very top of the mountain of Greccio, away from the caves, as if that wouldn't be, could you go back once? As if this wouldn't be remote enough, Francis built a hut on top of the mountain for himself. And that's where they built the first church dedicated to him. So the first church of St. Francis is right on the top of the Mount Greccio. So one of the things this tells us is that all these places and all the places you will go to visit on a tour of Franciscan holy places will be these hermitages. So one of the things, I mean, we have an idea of living in the city, in the midst of the poor and all that. That wasn't true in the beginnings of the movement and for much of the movement. Yes, they did go and work in the leper hospitals. They did go and work the farm fields, but these were the home bases. And so if you go, you're basically going on a tour of hermitages. So what does this tell you about what their life might have looked like? Especially the ones who were, like that phrase from the rule says, the oratores, who were the prayers. Now, one of the great stories when we have this discussion about contemplation action is the story of Francis. Should I be a hermit? Right? And so I've heard it said, well, he decided no, we're not hermits, so we don't have to do all this stuff. Who did he ask the question of? Claire. And what was Claire doing? And who was the brother he went to? Sylvester. And what does it say? The little tagline is Sylvester, who spent all his time in the hermitage. So who did he ask? A hermit? And Claire, who probably he expected to discern his vocation. But if he didn't really value that, he would have gone to them. And a study has been done of once he figured out, no, I'm going to be one of these preachers, or as I would rather put it, preaching hermits. A study's actually been done by someone, God bless them, who went through all the lives and analyzed the times and dates in all the lives to say, well, how much time did Francis, now that he was an active person, spend in a place like this? The least amount, which might be St. Bonaventure's life, 50% of his time. The most, which is in the Mirror of Perfection, I think, 75% of his time. So his idea of an active life was very different from our 21st century Western idea of an active life. Now, that doesn't mean that we have to go spend, unless you're called. You know, I often think in the principles it says, as we heard today, some may be called to a life of extreme poverty, following the example of St. Francis. The same could be said for the vocation to prayer. Some might be called to a more formal life of prayer. That for us, especially looking at the broad spectrum of lifestyle choices in the penitents and the friars minor, we run the gamut from the prayers, the workers, and the preachers. There's no reason any of those should be excluded from what we include in our vision of how to live this life. Now, what else would you notice about these places? Anything physically about them?
Quite inaccessible.
They're inaccessible. Somebody said beautiful.
Beautiful.
He had no problems picking pretty places. But what about the relation? If you now imagine again without this 14th century construction, you can go to the Carteret tomb. If you took away the 14th century construction and imagine caves and imagine wattle huts, what's their relationship with creation? They're swimming. They're engaged. They're interact. And I should have put it in here. If you look at what does a, God bless them, what does a Benedictine, especially Cistercians, do when they get somewhere? They improve it, right? And they tame it, right? I mean, Cistercians, the first Cistercians were famous. Citeaux was a swamp, right? So they're great agro engineers, and they improve it. You go to any of these places, or you imagine what they look like. We were like that, leave no footprint. They would probably have a garden for their own food, but even that, Francis says, you have to plant some flowers. You can't just be utilitarian. You would have a garden, but that would be it. So another way, and that would be true of our other, the ministry of those reformed Camaldolese in Ohio is planting trees on the mountain. So again, part of this tradition is the relationship with nature and creation. Next slide. So this is some of the woods at La Verna. Next, this is also La Verna. Beautiful. Imagine praying in this bed. This is a recent book which has become popular. Forest bathing, which is a Japanese term. The idea of the necessity to bathe in the forest, to go into the forest and let the forest speak. Thomas Merton said, all that can be said about solitude has already been said and better by the wind whispering through the pines. So,
also, forests have much higher levels of oxygen, and the air is full of antiviral and antibacterial things which are used to keep the trees healthy. So just being in a forest is physically really good for you.
So our ancestors in the movement lived in the midst of the forest, in these deserts, as they call them. So that's why I think that also is a necessary part of our Franciscan prayer life and this blend of action and contemplation. Next one. I grew up in the Bronx, which paradoxically is not what you usually think of my hometown, is the most green part of New York City. There's more parkland and even wild parkland. The only old forest within the bounds of New York City is in the Bronx, which was in walking distance of the apartment house I lived in. This is St. James Park, not as grand as the one in London. It was the glebe land, or the land given to the church to support the church, of the old Episcopal church in my neighborhood, St. James, and it became a public park. So this is the park of my childhood. So when I turned 65, I made a pilgrimage on that day back to my old neighborhood, and I went to the park. Next slide. And I went to find my rock. So this was the rock that we would play soldier as a fort. It was the rock from which we, down that little hill there, would take our sleds in the winter. And when I visited, next slide, and spent some time with my rock, I realized how important that rock was to me, and that I had a relationship with nature through that rock. I didn't have to live in Laverne. Would have been nice. I live on a beautiful island now, which is 1/3 nature preserve, and I constantly have to chase deer and turkeys from my backyard. So I'm getting the chance now to live in a place like that. But you don't, so some of you are thinking, well, I live in the middle of wherever, which is noisy and crowded. You can find this bond, even in the midst of that, even in, next, a geranium on the windows. Remember, in our Franciscan, Christ is present in creation, whether it's a beautiful forest or a distressed geranium. It was funny, I wish I was adept enough to bring the slide up, but my good friend, best friend in the States, I was sharing, Father Joseph Pei, one of our tertiaries, who's also a Korean priest who I worked with at a Korean congregation in the city. He's on their annual parish retreat, and they've gone to an OFM retreat house, Mount Alvernia, in upstate New York. It's a beautiful place where there's also a community of the Clares, who I used to bring manure to in my younger days for their garden. And he just texted me a picture almost like this. He took a picture of a windowsill on Alvernia with a geranium hanging at it. So I have to tell him, great minds think alike. And that I haven't talked to him, I presume it was a very lovely picture of this geranium hanging in the window in Mount Alvernia. Had that experience. Obviously, something moved him to take that picture. And so you don't need to be. So again, oh, I can't go to, Big Sur, I can't go, You don't need, nature surrounds us. And I think that's one of the integral things of our Franciscan, of this balance of action and contemplation. Somehow, so for me, I call it my desert day once a month, where I do not touch this or any kind of screen. And I just stay in my little hermitage of a rectory and basically be alone. But part of the day, every day I get to walk on the beach. So on the desert day, I go into the woods for at least 2 hours. That's my thing. so that I have, but to integrate that however we can, whether it's planting a geranium or taking a walk in the woods or in a park or in grounds like this, and to just breathe, as John said. Next slide. Oh, one of the other things of the desert tradition is the relationship with other creatures. Right? So this is Jerome, who I'll show you. We'll be seeing, it's kind of connecting to our seraphic father, believe it or not. And this is a story of Jerome, that he was teaching a group of novices, walking in, and everyone else fled. And Jerome went up and pulled the thorn from the lion's paw. And the lion became his friend and stayed with him the rest of his life. So the lion is the attribute of Jerome, who was a cranky old Sicilian. But apparently, what made it a lion is the only one that can take it. So this relationship with creatures, you know, Jerome and his lion. In the Orthodox Church, we have Seraphim and the bear. We have Calmkill and the white horse and Iona. All this relationship, even with our sisters and brothers in creation, is something we'll see. So Francis as a desert saint, a desert father. So in the earliest times, you could say in the somewhat disputed letter, who wrote it? Did Elias write it? The letter about the death of Francis and the stigmata. We'll compare Francis to Moses, who is the quintessential desert father. The burning bush experience, the 40 days in the desert. So Francis as Moses is very early. So that's one of the early ties we see people making. But as time goes on and people reflect on Francis's life, this becomes more part of the consciousness, and they recognize, well, and obviously, if the hermitages look like desert hermitages in their architecture, connection would be made that way. But this rhythm that Francis was a desert father, so that in art, you will start to see Francis, the hermit. Francis trying to capture what was it like in all those moments of silence and solitude. Francis the prayer. Next slide. And Jerome, actually the saint who will be paired with Francis the most in medieval art and Renaissance art, will be Jerome, because they're both seen as desert fathers. Also, the common thing, you know, memento mori, Benedict in his rule says that you should think of your own death at least once a day. And so the skull becomes the symbol of this remembrance of death. I think, in the old Capuchin refectories, there would be a skull at the head table to remember. And that's why in many paintings and statues of Francis, we'll see him holding the skull. But it's another attribute of the desert tradition. Next, here's Jerome and Francis at the cross. Next. A comparison in the middle is Jerome and two Francises. Next. Again, Jerome and Francis, Jerome and Francis, Jerome and Francis, Jerome and Francis, Jerome and Francis. Jerome, now here's a reredos, an altar piece in honor of Saint Jerome. And they put the two other desert fathers, Francis and Anthony of Egypt. Now, the other connection with Anthony, I cut out of this, is the Tau. So certainly the Tau cross probably came from his presence at Lateran 4, where the sermon by Innocent quoted the image of the Tau and the call to penance as a sign. And many people think that's what ignited Francis's love of the Tau, was his presence there and hearing this sermon by Innocent. But in Francis's time, and if you Google St. Anthony's cross, what's going to come up is the Tau. The Tau was a symbol of Anthony of Egypt. No one in Francis's day would have seen a Tau and not thought of Anthony of Egypt. It would be like me deciding, oh, I'm going to start this Franciscan book club. And I think since we'll be racing through all these texts, I'm going to use this swoop sign, like Nike. And I'll say, this is my Franciscan book club sign. Everybody would say, yeah, but it's really Nike. Which is one of the reasons why the Tau, for a lot of our history, was not as popular as it is now. The symbol, which was our symbol, was the conformities, the crossed hands. I mean, that's what's on my ring, with a Tau. So this is hitting both. Like the San Damiano cross, right? The San Damiano cross's explosion is a recent event because it was hidden for hundreds and hundreds of years by our good sisters, the Poor Clares, right? It was enclosed, and so nobody saw it. So if you look at the Giotto image of that chapter from Bonaventure's life in the Upper Basilica of Francis before the cross of San Damiano, even though the artist is very clear, like in the image that takes place in the town square, I think it's him with the poor man. I forget exactly which one it is. But you definitely see the temple of Minerva and you see the community building. It was very precise. But when you look at the, oh, that's an hour. When you look at the San Damiano cross in the picture, it looks nothing like the San Damiano cross. Even was only a few blocks away, because nobody saw it. Nobody knew what it looked like until right before the Vatican Council, when the sisters decided they were going to put it out in the 60s. Wow. And that cross, and then they put it out 2 or 3 more times and hid it again, and finally everybody said, get it out! And that's when it took off. So it's really only in our lifetime that the San Damiano became known. And part of it was the Vatican Council, because what was the message from San Damiano? Rebuild my church. So it was a perfectly timed exposure. The Tau the same way. So from that, one of the reasons was because it was so associated with Anthony of Egypt. And his order, the Antonines, wore a big Tau. And if you see an image of Anthony, he's usually got a big Tau which carrying a Tau. Anyway, that's an aside. Next slide. Here he's Francis with Romuald, who we saw, and Benedict. And of course, this famous painting of Francis, which is St. Francis in the desert, San Francesco nel Deserto, which was painted for the first hermitage we saw, San Francesco nel Deserto in Venice. That's what this was painted for. And this painting, of course, you could spend a week on. Mm-hmm. Now, quickly, what were the tertiaries, the penitents, doing when all this was going on? Much the same thing. So this first image is Conrad of Piacenza, who's probably one of the best known tertiary hermits. And he's wearing, this is the tertiary habit we've heard about, the tertiary habit, which was part of the tradition of the tertiaries, was the tunic without a hood or a cowl. The hood was a sign of living in community. So once the third order regular, there were always tertiaries who lived in community. Once that became formalized, Then they adopted a hood, whereas the secular tertiaries kept the habit without the hood. So whenever you see a picture of a tertiary saint, that's what they usually have on. So next slide. This I just put up, and this I didn't even know if you read. I don't know where I found this. I could never find it again. It's a prayer in some old prayer book that I found online ages ago. Ye holy, solitary men and women of the third order of St. Francis. And then it's a little litany of all our hermits. And then it prays, restore widely again to will thus to serve, that the desert may bloom again. It's a third order prayer. So the tertiaries are also, now this isn't a group of tertiaries, this is a pair of paintings. These are Capuchin hermits, and the paired painting with the Capuchin hermits is another painting that matches this of the Camaldolese. These are many of the our first saints in the third order. All of them hermits, recluses, and anchoresses. And this is Viridiana, who is one of the more interesting ones, who knew Francis, actually. She was alive at the time of Francis. And I talked about that relationship with animals. Viridiana's friends were two snakes that lived, she lived in an anchor hold, like Julian. And we had many of our saints were like Julian, many of the third order saints. And Viridiana was one of these tertiary anchoresses. And they were very upset that these two snakes had got into her anchor hold, and they came to get them out. She said, oh no, they're my companions. And so she lived with her two snakes. Another little colorful aside. Oh, this is Saint Puluccio, another tertiary hermit, and this is him as well. We're just going to find it. So, the end of this, my question is, so what? So this is a little peg doll of Conrad of Piacenza, which shows you how popular he is if he even has peg dolls, right? So what? So we've heard all this stuff. So what? Well, how would we try to incorporate this in what we are to do? Some of these movements and things that keep bubbling up. Because I think if we're really going to look at what Franciscan action and contemplation looks like, it has to at least resemble some of this. Right? So I think, what did I put up next? Oh, okay. So this is one struggle, or one way. This is the Poor Clare community in Galway. I forget what town it's in. Has anybody from this side of the pond been to this? No? So in them looking at their roots, the Poor Clares, and I know that our sisters started out as active Poor Clares. The only active Poor Clares I ever met were at the Institute, and they were Irish Poor Clares. I don't know, maybe they went to St. Bonaventure's to find their roots, so maybe they found them. I don't know, but they were only allowed in Ireland by the bishops if they would teach in schools. Right, so that was very common. That's what happened to the Capuchin friars in the United States, who usually stayed in more eremitical places and preached, but in the States, they became parish priests. And I know that's kind of an interior conflict for them now. So these Poor Clares decided that when they were building their new monastery, they built it in the form of a laura, incorporating both the ancient Celtic tradition, but also the desert tradition of the early Franciscans. So the round buildings are the chapels and common areas, And I think they're regular rooms. And then all those little cells are for specified times that they go and live alone in these hermitages. So this was their way of trying to adapt this, live this out. Next.
Sister Brijo here is she's been to Australia. She's from that community. Yeah.
Oh, from this community in Norway.
Yeah. She came to Australia quite often.
And so this is just another view of it, the buildings. We go next, and here's one of the little private hermitages. Now this is James Adderley, right? Who is the founder, one of the founders of the Franciscans of Divine Compassion, right? Now this was him projecting what he thought an Anglican Franciscan community would look like, or his dream of it. I didn't put the reference, that's terrible. It was some article I was reading. If anybody's really heads up, I'll look for it. So he'd gone on the road, tramping with wayfarers. He needed the friars to be free from the narrow local interests of parish clergy. He wanted the base to be a house of prayer in the country, a place apart where they could rest, where they could be trained in the discipline of prayer. From the friary, they could go out and expedite whatever work they found necessary amidst the poor. Could be teaching in elementary schools, or mission work, or helping wayfarers, but on a freelance basis. There could be no question of being tied to a specific place or specific work as a group. And priests would have no privileges over the lay members. The model for caring for the poor was flexibility and variety, responding to diverse calls, primarily as an individual friar, with the community being a product of the rest periods at the rural friary, where the emphasis on prayer would provide the support for the demanding vocation. It wasn't in this, I guess. But the community was a community in prayer, that the common prayer was the base of community, which goes back to the Camaldolese, who might have lived in hermitages, but always came up. Our rule for hermitages, they might be in hermitages, but they come to pray together. Or that model of the wandering hermits, that you're going out. Another example of this that I didn't bring in the last century in the Roman Church is a Saint Albert. Albert was a nobleman in the beginning of the 19th century or mid-19th century, who as a man in his 20s went off to war to fight for Polish independence, and much like Ignatius Loyola, got hit by a cannonball and lost his leg, became an amputee, became an artist, a full-time artist, a very famous artist, went to Paris, very well known as an artist, maybe at the time, the greatest Polish artist at that period, very famous, returned to Poland, painted a painting of Christ, and had a conversion experience. So he joined and received the habit of the Third Order of St. Francis, went to live, gave up everything, went to live at a homeless shelter, where, as often happens with charismatic figures, other people came to live with him at the homeless center, other men came. And so they became a Third Order regular community in vows. Again, like Paula says, that often has happened in our tradition, where we have to knuckle under some ecclesial authority. So he had to formalize it and become Third Order regular, but they kept their Third Order secular habits, actually. And started this network of homeless shelters and for alcohol abuse in Poland. And this
noblemen, as happened with Francis and Laverne, said, I'll give you whatever you want. No, we can't own anything, but let me lease some land for a hermitage. And the other brothers were all ticked off. He could have opened some more shelters for us. And Albert said, if there is no hermitage, we won't be able to keep the shelters. Now, they had a very suffering fate, this community. They're called the Albertines, the Brothers of the Third Order of the Poor of St. Francis. When the Nazis came into Poland, they closed the shelters, and many of the brothers died in the concentration camps. And those that survived then had the communists come in. And for years, so they're like a model of the suffering Christ. And they still exist, and the sisters as well. The community of sisters began, third order regular sisters. So, but that's an example of that bubbling up again. And any reform in our movement, whether it's the Recollects and the Capuchins, who were one of the models for Father Joseph in the founding in our province, said, I'm going to look to the conventional Recollects and the Capuchins. And that's why he chose Little Portion, which is in a way kind of a hermitage. Any reform, whether it's the observance, the Capuchins, always starts in a hermitage and in this milieu, always grows out of it. It always has. So that's something for us to look at. What do I have next? Do I have anything? Oh, Francis and the Cave of the Heart. This is the last one. This is from Chilano, I think. He would always look for a secret place where he might acclimatize to God, not only his spirit, but each part of his body. When he was visited by the Lord in public and lacked the seclusion of a cell, he would turn his mantle into a little cell. Sometimes having no mantle, he would cover his face with his sleeve so as not to betray the hidden manna. He would always screen himself with something, lest bystanders became aware of the bridegroom's touch. Thus, among crowds and the narrow confines of a ship, he could pray unseen. And then, if he could do none of these, he made in his heart a sacred enclosure. So I think what we're trying to figure out is how do we, throughout our lives, put our sleeves up? How do we find in the midst, if we're not fortunate enough to be called to a hermitage, how do we, in the midst of the city, in the midst of our work, find that way of making of our hearts a sacred enclosure? Therein lies the rub. And I'm glad I don't have to figure it out. Well, thank you. Any questions? Do we have time? I know we're up against the Eucharist.
No, the Eucharist is later in the day.
See, I'm so programmed.
We need to be at lunch at 1:45, and I just need to say a prayer and make an announcement. So we've probably got 5 minutes.
Oh, wow. All right. So any questions or did anything, if you wandered off when I was blabbing on, that's also a good thing to pay attention to what you were wandering off on. That might be the thing you need to pay attention to. But anything strike you or trouble you or surprise you or?
Going through all these pictures, I find it very interesting, the starting point and the ending point, because really, for me, the question is like, how do we find the hermitage in the center of New York when you're at the train station?
Right.
Yeah.
But I also think, if we honestly look at our tradition, I hope I don't offend anybody, but when I hear, my work is my prayer, well, that's very hard to achieve, unless you do leave the train station and go somewhere to be alone or to be silent. You know, when it says, I know the way it's put in the tertiary principles, we live in an atmosphere, strive to live in an atmosphere of prayer and praise. Well, if you don't have some element, somehow, somewhere, of solitude and silence, how can you live in an atmosphere of prayer and praise? So while I think the starting point, I'll talk about this tomorrow, the starting point is that conscious, formal, I don't know what word to use. In other words, there's some point you have to shut up and pray, or just shut up. You have to, there's no, it's like obedience isn't obedience until somebody asks you something you don't want to do. Right? That's where the rubber hits the road. And I think your work has to come out of that silence.